So this is extract 13 of Roald Dahl's Danny, the Champion of the World. Thursday and school. The next day was Thursday, and before we set out for the walk to my school that morning, I went around behind the caravan and picked 2 apples from our tree, one for my father and one for me. It is the most marvellous thing to be able to go out and help yourself to your own apples whenever you feel like it. You can do this only in the autumn, of course, when the fruit is ripe. But all the same, how many families are so lucky? Not 1 in 1,000, I guess. Our apples were called Cox's Orange Pippins, and I like the sound of the name almost as much as I like the apples. At 8 o'clock we started walking down the road towards my school in the pale autumn sunshine, munching our apples as we strode along. Clink went my father's iron foot each time he put it down on the hard road. Clink, clink. Have you walked money to buy the raisins? I asked. He put a hand in his trouser pocket and made the coins jingle. What, will Cooper's be open so early? Yes, he said. They open at 8:30. I really loved these morning walks with my father. We talked practically the whole time. Mostly it was he who talked and I who listened, and just about everything he said was fascinating. He was a true countryman. The fields, the streams, the woods, and all the creatures who lived in those places were a part of his life. Although he was a mechanic by trade, and a very fine one, I believe, he could have become a great naturalist if only he had had a good, proper schooling. Long ago he had taught me the names of all the trees and the wild flowers and the different grasses that grow in the fields. All the birds too. I could name, not only by sighting them, but also by listening to their calls and also their songs. In springtime we'd hunt for birds' nests along the way, and when we found one, he would lift me up on his shoulders so I could peer into it and see the eggs. But I was never allowed to touch them. My father told me that a nest with eggs in it was one of the most beautiful things in the world, and I thought so too. The nest of a song thrush, for instance, lined inside with dry mud as smooth as polished wood, and with 5 eggs of the purest blue speckled with black dots. And the skylark, whose nest we once found right in the middle of a field in a grassy clump on the ground. It was hardly a nest at all, just a little hollow place in the grass, and in it were 6 small eggs, deep brown and white. Well, why does the skylark make its nest on the ground where the cows can trample it? I asked. Nobody knows why, my father said, but they always do it. Nightingales nest on the ground too, so do pheasants and partridges and grouse. On one of our walks, a weasel flashed out of the hedge in front of us, and in the next few minutes I learned a lot of things about that marvellous little creature. The bit I liked best was when my father said, "The weasel is the bravest of all animals. The mother will fight to the death to defend her own children. She will never run away, not even for a fox who is 100 times bigger than her. She will stay beside her nest and fight the fox until she's killed." Another time when I said, "Oh, just listen to that grasshopper, Dad," he said, "No, that's not a grasshopper, my love, that's a cricket. And did you know that crickets have their ears in their legs?" It's not true. It's absolutely true. And grasshoppers have theirs in the side of their tummies. They're lucky to be able to hear at all, because nearly all the vast hordes of insects on this world are deaf as well as dumb and live in a silent world. On this Thursday, on this particular walk to school, there was an old frog croaking in the stream behind the hedge as we went by. "Can you hear him, Danny?" "Yes," I said. "That is a bullfrog calling to his wife. He does it by blowing out his dewlap and letting it go with a burp." "What is a dewlap?" I asked. "It's the loose skin on his throat. He can blow it up and down just like a little balloon." "Oh, what happens when his wife hears him?" "She goes hopping over to him. She's very happy to have been invited. But I'll tell you something very funny about that old bullfrog. He often becomes so pleased with the sound of his own voice that his wife has to nudge him several times before he'll stop his burping and turn round to hug her." That made me laugh. "Don't laugh too loud," he said, twinkling at me with his eyes. We men are not so different from that bullfrog. We parted at the school gates, and my father went off to buy the raisins. Other children were streaming in through the gates and heading up the path to the front door of the school. I joined them, but kept silent. I was a keeper of a deep secret, and a careless word from me could blow the lid off the greatest poaching expedition the world would ever see. Ours was just a small village school, a squat, ugly, red brick building with no upstairs rooms at all. Above the front door was a big grey block of stone cemented into the brickwork, and on the stone it said, "This school was erected in 1902 to commemorate the coronation of His Royal Highness King Edward VII. I must have read that thing 1,000 times. Every time I went in the door, it hit me in the eye. I suppose that's what it was there for. But it's pretty boring to read the same old words over and over again. And I often thought how nice it'd be if they put something different up there every day, something really interesting. My father could have done it for them beautifully. He could have written it with a bit of chalk on the smooth grey stone, and each morning it would have been something new. He would have said things like, "Did you know that the little yellow clover butterfly often carries his wife round on his back?" Another time he might have said, "The guppy has funny habits. When he falls in love with another guppy, he bites her on the bottom." And another time, "Did you know that the death's head moth can squeak?" And then again, "Birds have almost no sense of smell, but they have good eyesight and they love red colours. The flowers they like are red and yellow, but never blue." And perhaps another time he would have got his chalk and written, "Some bees have tongues which they can unroll until they're nearly twice as long as the bee itself. This is to allow them to gather nectar from flowers that have very long, narrow openings." Or he might have written, "Oh, I bet you didn't know that in some big English country houses the butler still has to iron the morning newspaper before putting it on his master's breakfast table." There were about 60 boys and girls in our school, and their ages went from 5 to 11. We had 4 classrooms and 4 teachers. Miss Birdseye taught the kindergarten, the 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds, and she was a really nice person. She used to keep a bag of aniseed balls in the drawer of her desk, and anyone who did good work would be given one aniseed ball to suck right there and then during the lesson. The trick with aniseed balls is never to bite them. If you keep rolling them round your mouth, they'll dissolve slowly of their own accord, and then, right in the very centre, you'll find a tiny little brown seed. This is the aniseed itself, and when you crush it between your teeth, it has the most fabulous taste. My father told me that dogs go crazy about it. When there aren't any foxes around, the huntsman will drag a bag of aniseed for miles and miles over the countryside, and the foxhounds will follow the scent because they love it so. This is called a drag hunt. The 7 and 8-year-olds were taught by Mr. Corrado, and he was also a decent person. He was a very old teacher, probably 60 or more, but that didn't seem to stop him from being in love with Miss Birdseye. We knew he was in love with her because he always gave her the best bits of meat at lunch when it was his turn to do the serving. And when she smiled at him, he would smile back at her in the soppiest way you can imagine, showing all his front teeth, top and bottom, and most of the others as well. A teacher called Captain Lancaster took the 9 and 10-year-olds, and this year, that included me. Captain Lancaster, known sometimes as Lankers, was a horrid man. He had fiery, carrot-coloured hair and a little clipped carroty moustache and a fiery temper. Carroty-coloured hairs were also sprouting out of his nostrils and his earholes. He had been a captain in the army during the war against Hitler, and that was why we all still called him Captain Lancaster instead of plain just Mr. My father said it was an idiotic thing to do. There are millions of people still alive, he said, who fought in that war, but most of them just want to forget the whole beastly thing, especially those crummy military titles. Captain Lancaster was a violent man, and we were all terrified of him. He used to sit at his desk, stroking his carroty moustache and watching us with pale, watery blue eyes, searching for trouble. And as he sat there, he'd make queer, snuffling grunts through his nose, like some dog sniffing round a rabbit hole. Mr. Snoddy, our headmaster, took the top form, the 11-year-olds, and everybody liked him. He was a small, round man with a huge scarlet nose. I felt sorry for him having a nose like that. It was so big and inflamed, it looked as though it might explode at any moment and blow him up. A funny thing about Mr. Snoddy was that he always brought a glass of water with him into class, and this he kept sipping right through the lesson. At least, everyone thought it was a glass of water. Everyone, that is, except me and my best friend Sidney Morgan. We knew differently, and this is how we found out. My father looked after Mr. Snoddy's car, and I always took his repair bells with me to school to save postage. One day, during break, I went to Mr. Snoddy's study to give him a bill, and Sidney Morgan came along with me. He didn't come for any special reason, we just happened to be together at the time. And as we went in, we saw Mr. Snoddy standing by his desk refilling his famous glass of water from a bottle labelled Gordon's Gin. He jumped a mile when he saw us. "You should have knocked," he said, sliding the bottle behind a pile of books. "I'm sorry, sir," I said. "I bought my father's bill." "Ah," he said, yes, very well. What do you want, Sidney?" "Nothing, sir," Sidney Morgan said. "Nothing at all." "Well, off you go then, both of you," Mr. Snoddy said, keeping his hand on the bottle behind the books. "Run along." Outside in the corridor, we made a pact that we wouldn't tell any of the other children about what we had seen. Mr. Snoddy had always been kind to us, and we wanted to repay him by keeping his deep, dark secret to ourselves. The only person I told was my father, and when he heard it, he said, "I don't blame him one bit. If I was unlucky enough to be married to Mrs. Snoddy, I'd drink something a bit stronger than gin." "What would you drink, Dad?" "Poison," he said. "She's a frightful woman." "Why is she frightful?" I asked. "She's a sort of witch," he said, "and to prove it, she has 7 toes on each foot." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Doc Spencer told me," my father answered. And then to change the subject, he said, "Why don't you ever ask Sidney Morgan over here to play?" Ever since I started going to school, my father had tried to encourage me to bring my friends back to the filling station for tea or supper. And every year, about a week before my birthday, he'd say, "Let's have a party this time, Danny. We can write our invitations and I'll go into town and we'll buy chocolate eclairs and donuts and a huge birthday cake with candles on it." But I always said no to these suggestions. And I never invited any other children to come to my home after school or at weekends. This wasn't because I didn't have good friends. I had lots of them. Some of them were super friends, especially Sidney Morgan. Perhaps if I'd lived in the same street as some of them instead of way out in the country, then things would have been different. But then again, perhaps they wouldn't. You see, the real reason I didn't want anyone else to come back and play with me was because I had such a good time being alone with my father.